So there are lots of questions in Econ 3 exams that ask about the relative merits of different market structures, and they're dressed up in various different terms. They maybe talk about breaking up a monopoly and whether that's advantageous. They talk about whether a government should increase the level of competition in an oligopoly or remove barriers to entry or those sorts of things. Really, the underlying question there is the same, and that's the question that's on the screen here. Is a competitive market better than a monopoly or an oligopoly? And it's a really important question in economics generally, not just in terms of Econ 3, but obviously in terms of answering your questions, it is a really significant one. It crops up in one form or another on most papers. Now, the key thing that we have to consider, really, before we go much further, is what we mean by this word. Because within economics, there are several different interpretations of better. And so I think we need to kind of clarify to begin with what we actually mean by better. So by better, one of the things that we may mean is that it's better in terms of the efficiency of the market. And we know that an efficient market is economically preferable to an inefficient market. But equally, now that we're at A2, we understand that it's still not as simple as that, because we have static efficiency and we have dynamic efficiency, and there is nothing at all that says that a market which is statically efficient will be prone to dynamic efficiency or vice versa. So that's a really important distinction that we need to make. And then even with static, we have to consider allocative and productive efficiencies. So whenever we think about efficiency, that in itself is a significant area for discussion within any sort of answer about the different market structures. One of the other big things that we need to think about is welfare. Okay, we talk about the goal of economics being to increase welfare given scarce resources, but what does that actually mean? Well, we can think about the welfare of the consumer. We can think about the welfare of the producer, and we can obviously think about the welfare of society in general. So again, several different avenues of actually approaching this welfare. For instance, one of the things we need to consider here is, if we trade welfare from a consumer to a producer, is that economically a bad thing? The welfare doesn't disappear. All we're changing is the person that benefits from it. So we have generated neither a net gain nor a net loss in society. All we've done is reallocated this welfare. And that's also a very important consideration of what we're talking about here. And another one that we need to think about is kind of related to that, which is equity. Is a market equitable? Is an outcome equitable? And by that we mean fair, but obviously fair again is a very subjective concept. So hopefully what you're starting to see is really that there is no answer to this question. That there is no categorical yes or no, and that's really the reason why this question crops up so many times in exams, is because there is no definitive economic answer. Is a competitive market better than a monopoly or an oligopoly? As with everything in economics, the answer is it depends. Okay, it depends on a whole load of different things. It depends on primarily the behavior of firms. Okay, so really, when you're tackling a question like this, you can work your way through the analysis and the various different forms of analysis. You can support it with diagrams and so on and so on. We're going to go through some of that now. But at the end of it, the answer to this sort of question is always going to be, it depends on the way that the firms actually use their power. So let's think about the first side of this argument, which is basically the side of the argument that says that competitive markets are better, and that concentrated markets should be broken up or regulated in some way. Now, there are two main arguments which you would use in an answer to justify this. One is static efficiency, and the other is maximised welfare. So let's consider static efficiency first and think about why a competitive market is likely to be statically efficient. Now, if I draw my diagram for my competitive market, we know that we can draw that as a pair of diagrams. The diagram on the left representing the market, where we have the market forces of supply and demand, which generate a market equilibrium, a price P and a quantity Q. Now we know that in a competitive market, the firms within that market must accept P as their price for all units. And therefore we end up with revenue curves for firms within that market being horizontal. All of their units are sold at the same price, therefore the revenue curves are horizontal. We also know that these businesses can't make supernormal profit, so that means that their average cost curve must perch neatly on top of those revenue curves, and we know that the marginal cost curve must break through average cost at its lowest point. So now that we've drawn those on, we need to think about the three key forms of efficiency. So if we shrink this down a little bit, then we can do that. So what are the three forms of efficiency? The two forms of static efficiency that we will think about. The third efficiency form we will look at a little bit later on. The efficiencies that we are going to look at here are productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. So let's think about each of those. Productive efficiency, we know, occurs when the business is producing that level of output which minimises average cost. That means where average cost is at its lowest, and we know that that happens when AC is equal to MC. Now, allocative efficiency means that we are allocating resources in the way which most benefits consumers. Put that another way, it means that the cost of producing an additional unit is the same as the cost to the firm of producing it, which means that that is where average revenue, price paid by the consumer, is equal to marginal cost, the cost to the firm of producing that unit. So let's look at our diagram again, and we see that MC equals AC is where these two lines intersect. So if we follow these lines back, we can see that these two lines intersect at this point here. So that's where MC and AC intersect. Let's think then about our allocative efficiency, AR and MC. So AR is here, MC is here. So if we trace both of the lines back this time, we trace AR back and we trace MC back, we see that these 2 points also intersect at this point here. So if we bring this down and refer to it as Q, then we can say that productive efficiency occurs at Q and allocative efficiency occurs at Q. Now that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that the market overall will be efficient. What we can say though is that we also need to think about where the firms will choose to produce. And we know that the firms will choose to produce where their profits are maximised. So where is that? Well, we know that profit maximisation is where MC is equal to MR. So let's think about those on our diagram then. MC is here and MR is here. If we trace both of them back, we can see that yet again we end up at this same level of output. So profit maximisation also happens at Q, which means that firms acting in their own self-interest will produce output level Q, and that is also the level of output which leads to productive and allocative efficiency within this market. And that's how we can explain why a competitive market is statically efficient. If we move on then, we can think about why welfare, that in the centre there, why welfare is maximised in a competitive market, or to put it another way, why we have no welfare loss in a competitive market. And this is an additional important consideration, and again we will touch on this a little bit more when we think about the impact of a concentrated market later on. So if we consider the maximised welfare then, if we draw the same situation but with a concentrated market, so the diagram on the left there is still our market. We carry the price across, which becomes the kind of the competitive market price, and that also coincides with allocative efficiency, and that gives us the output level of Q. We need to think about now though what the firm with its market power will do. So the diagram on the right now is a concentrated market. We know that the firm will seek to produce where MC is equal to MR, which is this level here. So that means that the monopolist will actually produce output level QM, and by restricting the supply, they're able to extract a higher price from consumers than they would have been able to in a competitive market. So they are able to charge price PM rather than price PC. So let's think about what that does. First of all, you will notice that what happens is that some of the welfare of the consumer is transferred to the producer. So the fact that the producer now gets a higher price for each unit means that that green shaded area there is what we call welfare transfer. Okay, so welfare transfer from the consumer to the producer. So society overall doesn't get any better or worse, but the level of consumer surplus is reduced as a result of the concentrated market here. Now that's unfortunate, but for the consumers at least, but as I say, overall society doesn't really lose. The thing we really need to worry about here though is the triangle on the end here, this blue shaded area. Okay, and we need to think about what's happened to that. Now that used to be, or would have been, consumer surplus. If the price was PC, that would have been included in the area of consumer surplus. But now that the price is higher, it's PM, we need to think about where that actually goes. It's no longer being taken by the consumer, it's no longer part of the area of consumer surplus, but equally it's no longer in the area of producer surplus either. Those units, the units between QM and Q, are no longer being sold, and that means actually that that area of welfare is actually entirely lost, and we refer to this as deadweight loss. So the blue area is deadweight loss. It goes from the consumer to nobody. It disappears. It's potential benefit for society that is no longer taken advantage of. And similarly as well, it's a little bit more substantial than that, because actually there is area of surplus that the producer loses as well as a result of their restricted sales. So that blue area of welfare lost actually comes all the way down to the cost curve as well. So the first area went from the consumer to nowhere, and the second area went from the producer to nowhere. Now it's still in the firm's interest to do that, because that second blue shaded triangle, I'll cross-hatch it back the other way so we know what we're talking about. So the cross-hatched area there, that is smaller than the green area. So it's still in this firm's interest to do it, but by these actions they actually have meant that we have lost welfare as society, what we call deadweight loss, a very serious form of market failure. Under a competitive market structure, obviously the firms don't have their ability to set the price above the competitive level, which means that that welfare loss cannot occur. So in a competitive market, we end up at running out of colour slightly here, let's take pink. We end up at price level C here. This is our price, and our output level is Q here, And under those circumstances, there is no deadweight welfare loss to society, and that's another major advantage of a competitive market structure over a concentrated one. So bringing it all back together then, we can see that there are two main lines of argument that we would use to suggest reasons why a competitive market is better than a concentrated market, and therefore to justify the regulation or the breaking up of a concentrated market. So the other side of the argument that we'll consider then is the side of the argument that suggests that actually, under certain circumstances, a concentrated market can be beneficial, or alternatively put another way, that markets are not always better when they are competitive. So three main lines of argument that we can adopt here. One is a natural monopoly, which obviously works best when you're considering a monopoly. Dynamic efficiency, which works well with oligopolies and monopolies, and multiple prices or price discrimination, which we generally talk about again when we're referring to monopoly. So let's move through these one by one. These are less theoretical, I suppose, less technical, these arguments. So we'll start with natural monopoly. So what is a natural monopoly? A natural monopoly is an organisation like Network Rail, like Transco, something like that. It's a business where there are huge fixed costs of production. And the fixed costs are so large that we normally refer to a monopoly as facing a downward sloping average cost curve. What does that mean? Well, it means if we think about their output over the long run, what we would normally expect from an average cost curve is that it would be U-shaped, and that a business would benefit from economies of scale, then constant return to scale, and then diseconomies of scale. And that's the long-run average cost curve that we would expect for most businesses. With a natural monopoly, though, it's a slightly different circumstance, and actually we don't have a long-run average cost curve that looks like that. A natural monopolist faces a different long-run average cost curve, and their long-run average cost curve is said to be downward sloping along its entire length, like so. What that means is they always benefit from being bigger in terms of the amount of output that they are producing. So what that means is if they are producing Q units, then they are facing an average cost per unit of P. Why then would it not be beneficial to break this business up? Well, if we were to break this business up, then the amount of output supplied by this business would rise. Would fall, beg your pardon, would fall from Q to Q1. Obviously, when this business was broken up, it would be opened up to competition. Other firms would enter the market and presumably take some of the customers. So the output of this individual firm would fall from Q to Q1. And the result of that is that the business would face a higher level of average cost. It would face average costs now of P1. So actually what would have happened under these circumstances is that by breaking up this natural monopoly, actually the government will have created inefficiencies. They will have removed some of the scale economies that this business was benefiting from, the result of which is that they may well pass these on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So when we're facing a natural monopoly, the key things to remember are a downward sloping AC, I suppose long run average cost, if we're being technical. Okay, so downward sloping long run average cost. What that means is they benefit from economies of scale. And as a result of that, breaking up a natural monopoly reduces efficiency because they now face a higher cost. Okay, and it may also mean higher prices to customers if the firms try and pass on these increasing costs. So the argument goes that if the industry is a natural monopoly, then the government really should leave it alone. What we often find in actual fact is that natural monopolies in many countries are actually operated by the government themselves, to essentially remove the danger that these natural monopolists exploit their monopoly position by charging higher prices anyway. So the economics of this suggests that the government shouldn't intervene to regulate and break up this market. What actually happens in many countries is that actually the government takes over and makes the monopoly public. So they bring it into the public sector. The aim of that is so that they can control the prices, prevent the firms from exploiting their market strength. So dynamic efficiency is next on our list then of reasons why a concentrated market might be better. Dynamic efficiency, we remember, is improved efficiency through time. Another way to think of this is innovation. So why could we argue that a concentrated market can be more innovative than a competitive market? The primary reason for this is the fact that in a concentrated market we can have supernormal profits. And those supernormal profits can be used to fund research and development, and that the research and development can generate innovation, which generates dynamic efficiency. So under these circumstances, you can argue that actually, provided the supernormal profits are used for research and development, that's important because they may not be. If they are used for research and development, then that can lead to innovation and dynamic efficiency. Now, an important kind of extra evaluation point that you can mention here is the insight of a chap called Baumol, who we will deal with a little bit later on in the course when we talk about contestability. And Baumol basically said that this occurs best in an oligopoly market. Why in an oligopoly market? Because in an oligopoly market there is an incentive to innovate which may be lacking in a monopoly. So in a monopoly, the argument goes that because the monopolist is protected by such high barriers to entry, and their market position is so secure, there actually is no incentive for them to actually innovate and to come up with new and better products. Once there are other firms there, then actually there is a degree of competition between those firms, although they still manage to benefit from supernormal profits, and therefore actually the non-price competition element of the research and development in terms of the quality actually then becomes the key factor. I suppose you could think about operating systems along these routes. So you could say for a very long time that Microsoft really sat back on its operating systems. So if you think of kind of some of their weaker offerings, you think of kind of Windows Millennium, and you think of Windows Vista, and some of their weaker options, they actually, as other competitors, primarily Apple, have entered into that market, and more recently Google, of course, with Google OS, actually that spurred Microsoft on, and you could argue that their latest offerings, Windows 7, Windows 8, and the kind of the soon to be released Windows 10, they are more innovative, they are more dynamically efficient. So that's an argument why actually having the existence of supernormal profits in the industry means that businesses can divert some of those profits to research and development, and through that generate dynamic efficiency and improve welfare in the long run. As a little added bonus to this as well, you can actually use this as a nice synoptic element, because dynamic efficiency also improves long-run aggregate supply within an economy. So this is a nice little link here where you can move between the micro and the macro sections of the course, which is an important skill to be able to do at A2. So an extra little bonus bit of evaluative theory there in the in dynamic efficiency. So the last one that we're going to think about then is a multiple price monopolist. This isn't really a circumstance where having a concentrated market is better. This is a situation where having a concentrated market might not be too bad. And the theory goes a little bit like this. It builds on what we saw earlier on, actually. So if I quickly sketch out the diagram here, okay, what we said, if we remember, was that we end up with a situation where you have a firm that is facing what would be a competitive price. So let's say that this would be their market competitive price, and this would be their quantity. Now, what the business may decide to do is it may decide to take advantage of the fact that it has monopoly powers by charging a higher price of, let's say, PM, and restricting the quantity to QM. Now, what they would do as a result of that is they take this area here out of the consumer surplus and it becomes producer surplus. But actually, it's not in this firm's interest to actually do that, because the area of revenue that they lose is greater than the area that they gain. But what they may then decide to do is that they may decide to offer an additional price for the same product. So an example of this might be a hardback book then followed by a paperback book. So the hardback book they sell at the higher price, and the paperback book they then sell at a lower price. We'll call PM1 and QM1. So what that means is that then the monopolist also then takes that area of consumer surplus and that becomes producer surplus. So we then end up with a slightly peculiar looking diagram where basically we end up with two areas of consumer surplus, area 1, area 2. The red and green areas then become part of producer surplus, and the area that is welfare loss is only this small yellow triangle there. So what this actually means is that a multiple price monopolist, a monopolist which can charge different prices to different customers, actually means that the output level, the overall output level, QM1, is closer to Q than it would have been. So a multiple price monopolist means that some customers pay a high price, others pay a lower price. Now, in overall economic terms, we can say that actually this is better. Why is it better? It's closer to allocative efficiency, which occurs at Q. So QM1 is closer to Q than QM is. And as a result of that, the area of deadweight loss is smaller. Okay, so by adopting multiple prices, the actually consumers that wouldn't be able to buy it at the higher price now can. So the consumers paying the lower price benefit from that. We're closer to the point of allocative efficiency. The area of deadweight loss is smaller. On the other side of the argument, though, here we can argue about inequity. And specifically, is it fair to charge some customers a higher price? Now, the problem with fair is that in economic terms, we really need to put inverted commas around it, because fair in economic terms is a very difficult word to deal with. So that's just really an open-ended thing that you can leave in your answer. So let's bring this back again to the overall situation. So what we can see then is that there are two main reasons why you would argue that a competitive market is better. One of those is that the area of welfare is maximised, and the other is that a competitive market will be statically efficient. There are three possible arguments that say that concentrated markets can be beneficial, or I suppose, to put that in a slightly different word, not harmful, and therefore there are situations where actually markets may not always be better when they are competitive. If you are asked about a monopoly, specifically a monopoly, then you can use all three of those arguments. If you are being asked about an oligopoly, then you want to focus mainly on the dynamic efficiency argument in favour of allowing the oligopoly to continue to exist. Of course, we are assuming under those circumstances that it is a competitive oligopoly rather than a collusive oligopoly. A collusive oligopoly will act very differently, and a collusive oligopoly demonstrates many of the disadvantages that we've already seen for a monopoly. So hopefully that's clarified a little bit about the arguments that you can use in an essay about whether competitive markets are better than concentrated markets.